Hello and welcome to The Wire. I'm Seema Chishti. Dr. Lea Ypi, our guest in Bookshop today, is a philosopher, a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics. She's a thinker, academic, a public intellectual, and many other things. And yes, the author of a stunning memoir about life in communist Albania as a child, and then as the regime collapsed as a young person in the new world that the 90s brought in. That's her book, Free. Her new book, Indignity, is set to be released on September 4. Welcome to The Wire, Dr. Ypi, Lea, if I may, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. We have much to speak about, Lea, and we'll sort of go through that. But first, I would have thought that after a book which is called Free, your next book would not be called Indignity, but Dignity. So tell us a bit about that first.
Yeah, I wanted to, in some ways, suggest with the title of the book that dignity is a kind of ephemeros quality and that it's very hard to see it materialized. And in fact, the world in which we live now is very much a world of indignity. And the book documents the struggle for dignity, but it remains very much a struggle and very much an ideal. And so I wanted the title to actually be much closer to the reality of the world that we observe and that the book documents.
Yeah. So, I mean, your portrayal of life in, we'll come back to Indignity, but Free, which we've read, is about the trauma, if you like, of communist regime and its collapse and then the new world. But it's not like an Arthur Koestler account. It's not like an account of a bad communist kind of. A lot of books birthed in the communist period of the transition spoke of it like that. So tell us something about the responses you got and your sense of being free, even as a child in communist Albania and after.
Yeah, the book really is about freedom in different political systems and the effort to distinguish between freedom as an ideal and freedom as an ideology. And it's in two parts, as you say. The first part is about growing up in a communist country. The standpoint of the book is that of a child who is surrounded by people who convince her that she lives in the freest country in the world. And she's a child and she believes that. And then only very slowly, with the transition, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the transition of the 90s, does she realize that actually what she believed was freedom was in fact something very different, and that many things about the kind of context that she lived in had been concealed from her. And what she finds herself is another world with another narrative of freedom, with its own ideology, and with another struggle to try and distinguish between those ideals of freedom that are now presented as though they have been realized, and the difficulty and the hardship of everyday life and the absence of that freedom and the search that continues even though it takes a different form. So really the book is about the disappointments or disillusionments of two different systems which take different forms but are equally far from freedom. And in many ways tries to capture precisely this idea that freedom is actually something that we are always looking for. It's something that, as I think is suggested also by one of the characters in the book, that's my grandmother, is connected to our moral dimension, to our capacity for moral agency. And if you think of freedom in that way, then the first thing to do, if you think of freedom in this kind of critical way, the first thing to do is to try and to ask yourself questions about what kind of society do you live, what kind of propaganda are you surrounded by, how are we always continuously manipulated, and how is ideology always playing a role in our life, even when we are told that this is now the end of ideology, this is the end of history, this is the end of a world in which it was only oppressive, and finally this dream of freedom has been realized, and how that itself could be a form of ideology.
Yeah, I mean, so I can't find any other word for it, but you know, the intellectual poise that you kind of maintain between speaking of the ills, if you like, or the absence of freedom in some sense in the world you saw as a child and after that. How did you really make that transition in your thinking? And at what stage were you able to think clearly through the haze and through the slogans of end of history and end of ideology? I mean, both as an academic and as a person who's experienced that.
Yeah, I think it took me a really long time. In the 90s, there was something wrong about this discourse that we are now finally free, and the discomfort of everyday life. You know, we didn't have books, for example. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the textbooks had changed in school. We had no electricity, there was real hardship. Material reality was clearly not satisfying for a lot of people. There was a lot of emigration, unemployment, and so on. So at the immediate experiential level, it was very clear that this dream of freedom had not been delivered yet. But I don't think I was able to articulate that intellectually at that point. point. It was only when I went to Italy and studied philosophy and began to really think about freedom, maybe in a more philosophical but also more detached and more critical way. And that's where this intellectual effort to then think about freedom and to distinguish it from ideology started to take shape. And I don't know that that process is complete, because we're always asking ourselves questions. And one of the things about freedom, I think, is that it is a constantly, it's a search. And so we don't really have a final answer to what it is and how it's realized. But I think that journey continues. It started in Albania at the level of kind of real life, and then continued in Italy at the intellectual level.
There's another book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Mariani Satrapi's Persepolis. I found a lot of resonance from a child who is sympathetic to the cause of breaking free of the Pahlavis and Iran, old Iran, and moving into the new Iran, but the disappointment of that, as it goes down the Islamic Revolution way. So is there something here about kind of this generation that kind of bridges that? And as that generation grows older, do you sometimes feel like going back to your country and letting it benefit from the fullness of your thinking and your ideas?
Yeah, although sometimes I also, in some ways, I have never left. I'm mentally still there, and and my country is still very much part of my concerns. And although I now connect the predicament of Albania to the predicament of other countries in the world, so I'm able to draw more parallels and to make distinctions and to think about the country in context. But I don't think we ever really leave home fully. Even if we're physically detached, the concerns are there because that's who we are. It's part of our upbringing. It's part of our self that has been constituted. So I often go to Albania and I try to engage with debates. It's always a challenge for intellectuals at what level of detail you engage with day-to-day debates. But I would say that mentally, I have, even if I left for a time and I was distant, I would say that I have actually very much gone back.
Okay. So, and gone back, I think you're right. Your forthcoming book, Indignity, has a lot of going back in terms of not just space, but also in terms of time. So tell us a little bit about how you decided to the photograph that you saw on Facebook and a couple of insulting comments about your grandmother on her honeymoon in 1941 in war-torn Europe. So take us through a bit of that and why you decided to write that book, Indignity.
So it's a book that is about the life of my grandmother, who is also a character in Free and is indeed the character that articulates this conception of freedom as connected to moral agency. But really the story started with me discovering this photograph of my grandmother that I had never seen before, posted on Facebook by a stranger, and followed by a number of derogatory comments and allegations that my grandmother had been a spy during fascism, then during communism, then both. And of course this was a photo of my grandmother that I had never seen before, because she had told me as a child that all of the photographs of her youth had been confiscated by the communists when my grandfather was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison during communism. And so I had always had these mental images of this honeymoon in the Italian Dolomites in 1941, with a lot of also question marks around what it meant to be on honeymoon in 1941, because this was a time where the war was entering its most destructive phase. And so you had this image of these happy people, but in a context of complete tragedy for the rest of the world. And so this raised this photograph and this encounter between how I had imagined those scenes and how actually what I was presented with and what was being discussed in the social media started this puzzle of actually wanting to know who my grandmother really was and to find the truth about her life, but also a more general philosophical question around the dignity of the dead who can no longer speak for themselves. And so she had always said that she associated dignity with having this capacity for making moral choices, but that is an active capacity. You need to be alive to protect and to defend your dignity. So when you're gone, the question is who has that entitlement and under what conditions can they stand up for someone's dignity if their own world is also a world of division and conflict, and in many ways eerily resemblant to the world in which she lives. So the book is really an effort to talk about, at a philosophical level, about dignity, but at the historical level about the ways in which history repeats itself. And so it's a revisiting and a reimagining of her life in the transition from Ottoman Empire to fascism, Nazism, and then communist Albania, but also a way of thinking about a number of questions that we still face now, which is the rise of nationalism, for example, this arms race, the beginnings of global conflict that then escalate into global war. And so the 1920s and 30s I've always found were an interesting period because they're so resembling to what we are now going through. And so for me, going into the life of my grandmother was also a way of asking a lot of questions about the world in which we live and why we repeat the same mistakes and why history repeats itself and how do we need to tell the stories of the past to avoid that history repeats itself in those tragic ways.
Is part of it fictionalized, or is it just a historical telling?
It's both. The book is a part of it is based on the archival documents that were held in the Secret Service archive of Communist Albania, so the surveillance documents of people who were spying on her. And so part of the story is reconstructed by just reading those files that were compiled by these anonymous collaborators with the Communist Party. But then a part of the question in the book is also how much can archives tell us, and how much does history, which is always told from the point of view of someone, has always a perspective, always also has manipulation and propaganda. What are the ways in which we can avoid falling prey to that and responding to those silences or those question marks in the archive? And that's where then the literary part enters. And so it tries to combine this more investigative element of looking into the files with then a reimagining and a more novelistic retelling of her life, first in Salonika and then in Albania in the 1920s and 30s. And so that is much more literary. And so it's a book that it's very hard to define in terms of what genre it belongs to.
Sounds very exciting. It sounds very contemporary. 1920s, we're there. So yeah, I mean, I really look forward to kind of reading that. Was there kind of a lot of pressure on you after the phenomenal success of Free? How did you kind of deal with that as an academic who likes to squirrel away behind shells and read books, and to have this kind of public-facing side of you, which does lectures? You do this brilliant podcast series with David Runciman. You're going to be doing another season. So how do you do that?
I like the public-facing events because I think it's a way of continuing the conversation. So I enjoy being on my own in my study and reading and writing, and there's a part of my life that just does that. But then I think that a part of intellectual life is also just being criticized and going and having debates and encountering the public and seeing how ideas, whether they resonate and how they are received. So I'm not too defensive. Sometimes, I get criticized, and Free had also a reception was share criticism, in particular in Albania. But I actually also enjoy that because I think it's part of the work of the book that it generates those debates. And sometimes the debates, when they are phrased in the right way and they are, they're not nasty or they're not petty or they're not aggressive or they're not personal, they can actually really advance the debate and they can make you learn as well.
So that's part of the stay in the library, I think, having the conversation and having the discussion.
Absolutely. I'm definitely not the kind of person that only needs the book and be on their own. I also enjoy this more interactive part of writing.
Free talks a lot about, and it's like a common theme that I've heard through all your lectures that I've kind of followed, and your podcast and your books, is the whole business of human agency, which you kind of really privilege and you vested with a lot of power. What's happening with this spirit and its ability to weather all this in the continent that you're in, which is Europe? You're in London now as a migrant. What's happening with the far right there, and what chance does agency have with this kind of far right shift that is almost moving Europe to the right?
Yeah, I think, it's obvious that to me, it's very clear that the right is filling a gap in terms of agency, actually. It's offering people a kind of agency that they felt that the elites had taken from them. So it's important to always begin this question around, how did the far right get to where it is and how did it become, it's not even far right now because it's mainstream, it's the government in a number of places. I think it's always good to ask the question of, what enabled that? And sometimes I feel that especially liberal or neoliberal elites are rather complacent about their contribution to the enabling of the emergence of the far right in terms of passing certain policies or the ways in which they responded to the financial crisis or the way that they addressed the crisis of globalization that was actually visible and ongoing throughout the 90s. But somehow now we have this idea that the 90s were the happy period in which everything, the world was fine, and suddenly this far right came out of nowhere and took out all the precious things that we cared about. And I think the story is a little bit more complicated. It seems to me that there was a fallout with technocratic elites, there was a fallout with neoliberalism, and the absence of an organized radical left, a progressive alternative, a kind of systemic response to the crisis of globalization was what enabled this gap to be filled by actors on the right that then offered nationalism or religious extremism or ways of thinking about community that were offering to people an answer to their alienation and disenchantment from the circumstances circumstances of their everyday lives. And so I think this is where we are now. And in a way, this is why this question of agency is so complicated, because the right does offer a response to this. It offers agency. It says, well, look, if you get rid of the immigrants, this is how you take back control. It's not a chance that this slogan of Trump, taking back control, or the Make America Great Again, taking back control was the Brexit one in the UK. But that these slogans suggest exactly agency and appropriation of your own lives, and that they are there precisely because they fill a gap, I think, and because they do address real concern.
And how do you think the entire rightward shift, because Trump, as you mentioned, with Trump coming back, Trump 2.0 or whatever it's called, how do you think the world is now navigating this? Because you also come from Albania, you're in India now, which are clearly countries as, not Albania maybe, but certainly India, in terms of the global south. There's such an attack on even just calling it the global south or its existence. Do you see it as having a chance at a time when Trump has the control of the White House and is deciding actually lines on the map, and he has ideas about what he needs to do with Greenland, Canada, and even with Ukraine and Russia? So how do you see all of that kind of
Well, I mean, I
moving?
think in a way, what's interesting is that, of course, from the point of view of a country like Albania, for example, who is used to crisis all the time and to changes in regimes and systemic, fundamental changes, major cataclysmic shifts in society, often people observe Trump and they don't react with the same kind of awe, surprise and awe as the elites in Western Europe, for example, because we're used to having, every 30 years something happens, or we have wars, and we have, it's very much part of people's lives. And sometimes I joke with my friends in Albania that we can teach survival skills because in many ways we're more prepared to sort of navigate. And maybe this is the time in which the fallout of this neoliberal perfect narrative of advancement of developed countries that have to teach lessons to developing countries, precisely the fallout of that narrative maybe creates also opportunities for saying, well, this shows us that the world has always been more complicated and that there are lessons to learn even from countries on the periphery like Albania or like places in the global south. And so I think that can be paired with an opportunity for agency as well. But of course, agency doesn't come by itself. It needs to be constructed, and it requires the right kind of narratives. And what concerns me is that the narratives that would be able to criticize globalization but also not retreat back to the emergence, to the rise of nationalism or religious extremism and so on, unfortunately are not there, because the left is very much playing in the defensive, and so it's always trying to chase the right on its own terms rather than coming up with its alternative vocabulary and its alternative explanation and alternative suggestions of a systemic shift.
So I think, that could really be a problem. Gaza, it's sort of almost like the camel in the tent, which people see, it comes to our phones, even unlike the Holocaust, which was not really well known till it kind of was unveiled after the camps were liberated, etc. Gaza is visible, it's there, governments know what's going on. Unlike apartheid and the Holocaust, which later after that saw a positive response in the world and governments were pushed into taking action. Do you think Gaza is actually, we can't see it, but it's that kind of a moment in world politics, global shifts, and that shift will happen?
I think it's difficult, because I think at the level of citizens, there is a response to Gaza.
Precisely.
And precisely what you say, the fact that we now all have access to news, and so we all see these images. Many people can go beyond the propaganda, and they can really call out the complicity of their elites, and they can see that there is this real divide between, for example, championing liberal values and seeing what's happening and what your governments are complicit in, with funding or with being unable to divest from Israeli companies, for example, or with funding weapons. And so I think on the ground, certainly at the civic level, there seemed to me to be a lot of sensibility around Gaza. And this is what's revealing this real divorce between what the elites are up to and what actually people are much more sensitive.
Will that pressure work? We see it in some measure working, because I don't know if Keir Starmer in the UK would have changed his mind, but for the polling that's coming, the polling that we hear about, how public opinion, even in the United States, even amongst Republicans, appears to be shifting. So how does that people power, like an opportunity that was missed in 2010, say in the Occupy movements, vis-a-vis Gaza, do you think it has the power and the momentum to shift?
I doubt, I'm skeptical that it can happen on a single issue. Although I think Gaza is a very important mobilizer, and as an issue, it's so obvious that injustice and the horrors that are unveiling in front of our eyes every day, it's obvious that they move people. But I don't think that a single issue without a mass political movement that also takes an organized form and that applies itself to all other issues in society that are connected, even though these realities seem to be completely divorced from each other. Unfortunately, the reality of kind of globalized capitalism is such that we are complicit, and the dynamics are also integrated and connected with each other. There are reasons that there are reasons for why, for example, European governments are reluctant to stop funding Israel or to divest for certain companies that are also financial reasons, so have to do with the dynamics of capital accumulation. So I think for that it takes more than a single issue to mobilize the public. Although the single issue can be a really important catalyst, and this, as I say, the scale of injustice and the kind of egregiousness of this plays a really important role. What we need is actually parties, or at least movements that organize themselves like parties and that are able to then take up the sitting parties in terms of also political representation and electoral representation. So I doubt that without that shift, without real organization at the structural level, one can hope that very much can happen on single issue mobilization.
So, I mean, all of us who speak of late stage capitalism and in the hope that it may just fall off the cliff finally and it's kind of, super advanced and it needs to go. Are such people optimists? Because while the world seems ripe for socialism, it doesn't seem like it seems to be moving in that direction. So is there a...
Yeah, I think we're still suffering the consequences of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And while I think I agree with you in many ways, the world is ripe for socialism because there's a problem with capitalism, and so you need an alternative. I also think that in many ways, in particular Western European countries and the left in Western European countries hasn't quite settled accounts with the problematic legacy of socialism in the 20th century. So I think what we need is an alternative that can reckon with also the injustices of the Cold War and the failures of democracy in these former socialist states. And so a real alternative would have to reckon both with the failures of the capitalist world, but also with, in many ways, the limitations and the failures of the socialist world, and learn from both experiences and try and think about, okay, what could we do better? How can we learn from these failures? How can we democratize these movements? I think without that, it's unlikely that socialism can return, because I think there's such a dramatic legacy of it that on the ground, there's a reason why in Eastern Europe or in Albania, you go and talk about Marx and people say, well, we know everything about Marx. We've already done it. We've seen that. We've been there, done that. So in a way, what is needed is an alternative that can speak to that concern rather than just say, well, no, you actually haven't seen it because you're just these backward Eastern Europeans that actually didn't get it right the first time around. And so now when the Westerners this is like, so in a way, it's also, it sort of enters with this sort of quasi post-colonial approaches and colonial mentality in how you think about including questions of socialism for a real alternative to emerge.
Yeah. Lea, the world around us, I mean, Adam Tooze has calls it a polycrisis. There are views on that. There's also this sense that clearly technology, climate and politics is all sort of really kind of whipped up, extreme, and all sort of happening at a absolutely galloping pace. What gives you hope, maximum hope amidst this?
Yeah, well, I think hope is a kind of moral duty.
That could be the title of one of your books.
And so I don't think that anything in the world needs to go, and on this I agree with the former Czech dissident Václav Havel, who used to say that, nothing in the world needs to go well for us to have hope, because hope is an attitude of the mind, it's not an attitude of the world. Paradoxically, the worse the world goes, the more hope we have to have, because we have to have the kind of agency that is needed to then change things. And so I think I don't ask myself, is the world going in the way that conforms to how I would like it to go? I just think that hope is a kind of attitude that needs to be there, that is almost like a categorical imperative, and it needs to be there for us to be able to respond in the right way to all this crisis. And we actually just cannot afford not to be hopeful.
So you think that there's really no choice but to be hopeful to kind of advance, but there's nothing there that like gives you hope.
It's not. I don't know. It's not a question that I ask
You're
myself.
not looking
I
for
don't
that,
kind of
yeah. You're
look.
not
I don't
looking
look
for
for
that,
it.
yeah.
No, in a way, it's just all that is needed for me is just this
Just
urge to act and to do something. And of course, each of us does that in their position. You know, a journalist does it in one way, an academic does it in another way, a worker, a doctor. Everyone in their social role can contribute and can engage critically with society if they have sort of right reading and the right categories and the opportunities for organizing and getting together and discussing with others, and if there is sort of democratic debate more broadly speaking. So I think, yeah, that's what gives me hope, is this imperative and this urge to act in such a way that these spaces are created and that people can come together and then respond to events.
Okay, let me flip that question then. What is that utterly terrifies you? Something here, is there the one thing? Is it AI? Is it kind of climate? Is it, what do you think is the clear and present danger in the way in where we find ourselves in 2024?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's we spoke about Gaza. So for me, just seeing this divorce between what goes on an everyday level in Gaza and how elites in Europe respond, and the kind of hypocrisy and the discourses, and this gap between the values that we hold and then the just blatant violation of international human rights law, of international law, of all kinds of agreements that countries fought for decades to create and to come up with. This divide between the world of ideals and this material reality, which obviously Gaza is not the only context in which this happens, but for me it's so glaring, and every day on my phone I just see this divide, and this is the hardest thing. And of course, all the other challenges that you mentioned are connected and are sources of concern, but you asked me this kind of
The one
visceral,
question.
immediate level.
Yes,
I think
yes.
that's probably what I would single out.
Okay. Lea, you spent a lot of time in India, and this is your first visit. What are the memories? What is a few memories that you like take back? What struck you? What was interesting? What was ghastly?
I found India wonderful and overwhelming in equal measure, and I think I was struck more than I thought by the inequality and by this kind of real gap between how clearly rich people live, the opportunities they have, and then just the life on the streets. There is an energy to that which is also very strange, and I somehow recognize it from Albania as well, where it's not. I would say that the images are more striking than Albania. So I thought that I found things in India that were very familiar in many ways, in the culture, in the way in which people communicate, in the sociability, and so at the very sort of anthropological, anecdotal level. But I think the thing that struck me the most is actually the just inequalities that you see on the streets, and just this exposure, this constant exposure. I find that really, really hard to take, and I'm here with my children, also very, very hard to navigate with, when do you give charity, and when do you say, I run out of cash now, or how do you explain to children that there are these children who are walking with bare feet and without food, or asking you to feed while they're here on holiday, and they're children just like them. And as I say, these are all phenomena that I had also seen in Albania or in other countries that I had been to. I think in India this was crystallized and was darker and really hard. On the other hand, I found the culture incredible, and just the diversity of the country, and we've only really barely scratched the surface of what we could see, and the monuments. Again, there it makes me realize that the country the culture of the world is all integrated, and seeing places in India, historical places, from the Sultanate, from the Mughals, you realize that this is actually not one country and not one culture, but everything is in here, and something similar that tells you the story of the world rather than just the story of this one place. So it's been really wonderful and sort of educational and instructive at that level.
Yeah, actually, just hearing you say that also makes us see India, interrogate things that we kind of take for granted. So that was good. Any Indian philosophers or thinkers that have struck you, or you've passed by in your books, which you'd like to explore more?
Yeah, well, we returned to, I had done a fair bit of reading on Gandhi, and we returned to Gandhi, and we read a little bit more as we were coming here. I have just begun to read a little bit into Ambedkar, and I really like this approach that is both enlightened but also rooted. And I think it's a very nice way of responding to a number of criticisms of people who say that enlightenment or universalism is only of the West and is only used in this kind of colonial function. So I've found in Ambedkar's writings writings a way of responding to some of these criticisms. And
both actually very deep-rooted thinkers and transformational kind of people in the Indian scene.
And of course, I've been reading work by Amartya Sen for a really long time, also for my studies, and so I've been always really interested in his work.
And you were on a panel with him in June.
Yeah,
was that fun?
It was great. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. And finally, returning back to Free, Lea, before we read Indignity, any chance that it would find a new life on Netflix as a documentary, as a film, because it's actually quite graphic, and the metaphors you use to describe the Coke tins kind of lined up and all is quite striking. So
yeah, there are still lots of proposals floating around. Nothing materialized yet that I can say here.
But that would not be something that you'd rule out.
No.
And would you like to star in it, or
no.
leave it to other people?
I think there are better people starring than me.
Okay, all right.
It's enough to star in my own life.
Yes, correct. Yeah, it's hard enough to do that. And thank you so much for starring in our show in Bookshook and for spending time and making it here. Thank you very much, and good luck with your book.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Bye bye.